thank you everyone for tuning in. And thank you for tackling that quite difficult icebreaker question, defining yourself in one word. I think it's really odd how we always play it safe with the questions that we ask when we first meet somebody, like, what do you do for a living? As if that's the key to anybody's identity. And we never ask questions that require candid or vulnerable answers that reveal anything about ourselves. And you guys all just did. And I don't think it was as bad as you thought it might be. So thank you for that. As Alex said, I called this talk Known Associates because one way of looking at identity is as the collection of ideas and traits that you are known to be associated with. And now this group is all known to be associated with some really interesting single word ideas. And I'm going to tell you what mine is a little bit later. But first, these are some real life known associates of mine. These are my 4 daughters. And this picture was taken in Marseille in July 2017. It was our first visit to continental Europe after the Brexit referendum. And it was the first time that I deliberately denied my English identity. Everyone was obviously asking about Brexit, and I felt it was convenient to say that I was from Scotland or from Edinburgh. I didn't say I was Scottish, I just said I was from Scotland, because I wanted to be known to be associated with certain ideas like freedom of movement and cultural diversity. And being from Scotland was a really good shorthand for that. And if you want to be known to be associated with an idea, using a powerful shorthand is a really good way of doing that. So for instance, this is Creative Mornings. We are all creative people. And I suspect that a lot of us, maybe even most of us, use Macs. And a MacBook does lots of jobs really, really well. But one of the jobs it does exceptionally well is as a shorthand for being a creative person. So when you fire up your laptop in a coffee shop, that Apple logo says, I am a creative person. And Apple knows it as well. They did a whole campaign around I'm a Mac and I'm a PC. And I'm just going to play one of their ads, which you'll hopefully hear.
Hello, I'm a Mac.
And I'm a PC.
I'm into doing fun stuff like movies, music, and podcasts.
And I also do fun stuff like spreadsheets and timesheets and pie charts.
Yeah, PC, it's quite hard to capture a family holiday with, say, a pie chart.
Not really. For example, this light grey area could represent shenanigans and tomfoolery, while this dark grey area could represent hijinks. And you see here, we further divided hijinks into capers, monkey business, and just larking about.
Wow. I feel like I was there.
Yeah, I find that ad a little bit confusing because I use a Mac and I'm no big fan of timesheets, and I'm ambivalent about spreadsheets, but I do like a pie chart. And I think part of my identity is that I'm sort of pie curious, maybe. And often when I think about identity, I have a sort of pie chart in my head with lots of different slices. And for me, obviously, being English is quite a small slice. I know for a lot of Scottish people, their nationality is a much bigger slice of their identity. But I think we've all got slices for, so I'm just going to move this a bit. We've all got slices to do with our beliefs, our principles, sexuality maybe, personality traits, foibles, fetishes, phobias, performative experiences, maybe some kinks, and even the odd perversion. And a lot of our private identity is private for a reason, obviously. But what happens when we want to think about our public identity? When we go from our private identity to our public brand, how do we choose the ideas that we want to be known to be associated with? And how do we get those ideas to stick? Well, that's the stuff of strategy. That's what I've done for most of my career. And if I've learned one thing from a career in advertising, it's that if you want to stand for something, one of the best ways of doing that is to stand for one thing. So you go from a big slice pie like this. Why is this not playing the next slide? Sorry. Oh, there we go. From a multi-slice pie to just one big pie with no slices, a single-minded pie. And I think the best brands kind of work like this. They are blunt instruments. A lot of brands, the best ones, are in fact one-word blunt instruments. So Volkswagen is about reliability, Volvo is about safety, and KitKat is all about break time. And the best brands have this ability to focus on one idea, and they have an ability to commit to that one idea over time as a shorthand for their broader identity. And it's not just commercial brands that do this really well, it works in politics too. And in my opinion, sadly, the right people are quite bad at this, and the wrong people, sadly, are really, really good at it. So for instance, Donald Trump hung his entire political identity off this one single shorthand idea. And the Conservatives won the last election with this one single-minded shorthand idea. And this is what strategy looks like. And it is really difficult because you have to be good at two things. You have to have the vision to make the right choices about what idea you want to be associated with. And then you've got to have a sort of commitment and doggedness to follow through on that idea over time as well. Being good at one of those things is quite difficult. Being good at both of those things is really rare, but it's really powerful. And I was going to try to illustrate that with a case study, which is all about me, actually. So this is my turn to answer this question. This question was on a handwritten application form for an event called the Do Lectures, which you might have heard of, and I applied in 2016. The Do Lectures takes place on a farm in Wales. There are 20 speakers and there are 80 delegates, and you spend 3 days and 3 nights together, giving lectures or being lectured to, spending time over meals and coffee and workshops and late night philosophical discussions on hay bales. And the application form for the Do Lectures is really interesting because it's all about identity. The first question on the form is, who are you, in 50 words or less? When did you last inspire yourself? What bugs you and what would you like to change? And if you had a motto, what would it be? And then obviously this question as well, what one word defines you? And this was my answer. Speculative. I obviously thought about this quite hard because I wanted it to be a word that appealed to the organizers. I wanted it to be a word that was true of the person I already was. But I think with hindsight, I was also thinking about the person that I wanted to be in the future. I did already have some form for taking a speculative punt on things. So for instance, a few years before the Do Lectures, a friend of mine and I and his dad, we bought a second-hand ambulance on eBay, and we drove it across Europe and Central Asia to Mongolia as part of an event called the Mongol Rally. And this was the route we took. I took 3 weeks off work. I was gone for 5.5 in the end, partly because of that speculative detour to the south through lots of countries ending in Stan, but also because lots of things went wrong on the way. The ambulance kept breaking and things falling off. And in fact, roughly where that red dot is in Mongolia, one of the wheels came off at about 30 miles an hour, which was exciting. This was the aftermath of that. And that's me in the green t-shirt supervising. So I had been speculative before, but I was starting to think about being speculative as a strategy. And I was sort of single-mindedly, knowingly associating myself with that idea. I was going all in on this one slice pie. And just before I headed to Wales for the Do Lectures, I speculatively applied to join the board of Puppet Animation Scotland as a non-exec director. And 4 years later, I'm the current chairperson. Puppet Animation Scotland is regularly funded by Creative Scotland, and not surprisingly, its job is to nurture artists and promote various art forms, all of which are art forms based on subversive storytelling. And at least 1/3 of the board has to be practicing artists. So it's a really lovely environment to learn new types of storytelling and different approaches to the creative process. And a lot of that inevitably has crossed over into my professional life. So I was doing all this before the Do Lectures. At the end of the Do Lectures, there is a charity auction in a cowshed with nice lighting. And the 20 speakers each put in a money can't buy item that the 80 delegates can bid on. And one of the speakers was this guy, Conrad. Conrad is the founder of a coffee trading company called Falcon Coffees. And he buys coffee at origin in Africa and Central and South America, and he sells it to roasters, so small artisan roasters and big roasters like Starbucks. And his talk was about sustainable supply chains and how all the value that's created by the coffee industry, which Washington talked about last month, how that value can be more fairly distributed through the supply chain, and how the smallholder farmers who are on the front line of climate change and constantly on the edge of poverty can get their fair share of that value. But it was also a really personal talk by Conrad, and he talked about self-doubt and he talked about going bankrupt. And it was a very candid and vulnerable talk. And the prize that he put into the Do Lectures for this auction was a trip with him to Uganda, 8 days to see how coffee farming actually works on the ground in Africa. So to cut a long story short, I sort of put my hand up, and I kept my hand up until it was the only hand that was still up, about £100 short of the limit I'd set for myself. So it wasn't the cheapest act of speculation ever, but it was brilliant value because Uganda was a total revelation. It was the first time I'd seen climate breakdown at first hand. They've got diseases like coffee rust, which is basically chasing the coffee trees up the mountains as the temperature rises. And it was the first time I'd seen how precarious our food system is. 70% of the world's coffee is grown by smallholder farmers like this woman. And in fact, 70% of a lot of our food is grown in the tropics by smallholder farmers like this woman. And if we don't keep people like her above the poverty line, the whole thing is going to collapse. So this picture was taken on Mount Elgon on the border between Uganda and Kenya. And when I showed her the picture on the back of the camera, she looked me in the eye and she said, "Now you will take me with you." And she was very right. She was so right. So the story here is that being speculative was proving to be quite a rewarding strategy for me. It was a good idea to knowingly associate myself with. So I kept it going. And not long after I got back from Uganda, a friend of mine, Patrick, in the glasses in the picture, got in touch. Patrick had been a journalist with Reuters, and he'd covered the City of London, and he'd covered the EU in Brussels, and he'd worked in Kuala Lumpur on the business and finance sectors. And what he'd seen as a journalist was the way in which big business and governments and the mass media are basically colluding to subvert democracy to their ends and against the ends of we citizens. And Patrick wrote a book about that collusion. And his next project was to make some documentary films about innovations in direct democracy, which was invented in ancient Athens. And the Greek word democracy literally means people power. The people, citizens, exercise power directly, not through elected representatives. In fact, the Greeks would have seen elections as anti-democratic. Elections lead to oligarchy, not democracy. So Patrick approached me for some marketing advice about these documentaries, but being speculative, we went all in and we set up a not-for-profit documentary production company called All Hands On. And this picture was taken in Athens last May in a film we were shooting during the European Parliament elections. And since then, we've had commissions from Extinction Rebellion as well to make 2 films. One of their demands is a more direct democratic approach to policy making. And as part of those commissions, we met this man, spent some time with him, Roger Hallam. He's one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion. Lost all his ex-farmer, lost all his crops to climate change, but he's also a brilliant strategy person. He could teach a lot of marketing people a thing or two about strategy. He's got that thing I talked about earlier, this combination of vision and doggedness to see things through. So being speculative, I'm sort of learning all the time from really interesting people like this. And we also got talking to this organization, Narrative Initiative, based out of New York, and they are helping progressive organizations be more strategic about narrative and identity. So through them, I've learned about new models for change and new frameworks for communication. And basically, there's a pattern emerging that I was speculating on side projects and accumulating new friends, new knowledge. And as a result, my professional identity was evolving. At work, I was becoming known to be associated with ideas to do with politics and the arts, as well as brand strategy. And the upshot of all this was I was really starting to think about what I wanted to do and who I wanted to be. And by knowingly associating myself with this single word idea, speculative, a whole sort of world had opened up. And I found myself at a sort of crossroads. And this next slide is a graphic representation of that crossroads. Some of you might be familiar with the Japanese concept of ikigai. If you're not, I will give you a quick guided tour of this deceptively simple Venn diagram. The first circle here is about what you love doing. The second one is what you are good at doing. And the intersection between those 2 things is your passion. The third circle is what you can be paid for, and hopefully you're good at that too, and that's your profession. And then the final circle is what the world actually needs. If you can be paid for doing what the world actually needs, that's a vocation, and the intersection between what you love and what the world needs is your mission. If you are very lucky, or maybe very strategic, or maybe both, you can operate at the center of this diagram where all 4 circles overlap. And that is a state of ikigai, which is the Japanese recipe for true fulfillment in life. And I really like this framework because it confronts ideas to do with both your personal and your professional identity. And if you work as a freelancer, that's really important because your clients are buying not just your skills and your experience, but also buying you as a person. So it's inevitable that it has issues of both personal and professional identity. And I found this a really useful model for strategizing about my work and life. And I used this model to make the decisions I needed to make to ditch my secure employed job and embrace a freelance lifestyle. Doing that in February this year, with hindsight, was not the best timing, but it was strategically decided. And this, excuse me, slide here is the kind of like the before picture. This is where a speculative approach had got me. My side projects were feeding my need for passion and mission, excuse me, and were feeding into my professional life. But it was making it more and more obvious that my day job had some quite serious shortcomings. I used to love advertising and making digital products, but it was becoming harder and harder over time to suppress, I think, the cynicism that naturally comes with getting older in an industry that is still, sadly, mainly for young people. And work was starting to feel a little bit futile. And what was obvious is that if I kept the status quo going, I was never going to get closer to that state of ikigai. So this was the before picture, and this is not where I am, but this is where I am trying to get to. I'm trying to engineer a shift in the nature of the work I get paid to do work that I love and that I feel that feels useful. And I don't want my side projects to be on the side anymore. I want them to take up more of my time. So this is where I'm trying to get to. Going from employed to freelancer is part of my strategy. The other part of the strategy is what's going to be my professional identity. What's going to be my freelance equivalent of speculative? What freelance professional advisor ideas am I going to be known to be associated with? And it's funny that this enforced downtime through this lockdown, it's an odd time maybe to be thinking positively. It's an odd time to be thinking about ideas like fulfillment. But I think with the right attitude, it's actually a really good time for some reflection and some good time for some creative thinking about these things, about what my professional identity is going to be when we come out of the other side of all this. I'm not going to tell you what the professional equivalent of speculative is, because I don't know yet, but I am thinking about it really hard. It's a work in progress. And if you are interested as a result of all this in where I get to, then I'm afraid you're just going to have to watch this space, the end. So that was it on identity. I hope that was useful.